Smack Jensen's roundhouse kick slammed straight into the left side of my ribcage, right where the old scar tissue throbbed. The air rushed out of my lungs. I collapsed onto the freezing tatami mat, the metallic taste of blood pooling in the back of my throat. "Get up, you piece of trash. You're nothing but a punching bag," Jensen sneered, driving the toe of his custom sparring shoe into my shoulder. "Did you forget who you are?" Just outside the mat, Jaden, his twin brother, stepped closer. He pulled out a gold-plated money clip, peeling off a stack of $100 bills and throwing them right at my face. "Pick it up. Go buy some diapers for that garbage kid of yours." Jaden hissed, his eyes dripping with upper-class contempt. "Evelyn was right. Women like your mother were born to be stepping stones for us. Is this all you learned? How to be the Hart family's floor rag big sister?" Their shrill laughter twisted like poisoned knives in my chest. That vicious stepmother stripped away everything my father built, reducing me to a bottom-tier janitor inside my own family's gym. I was ready to swallow my pride, take the beating just to get $500 for my daughter Chloe's winter coat. But they made a fatal mistake. They insulted my dead mother. They insulted my little girl. They thought I was just a broken woman clinging to their charity. They completely forgot who I really am. I slowly pushed myself up off the mat, blood seeping through my teeth. The submissive gaze of a servant vanished. I reached up, ripped the foam headgear off, and threw it hard against the floor. My eyes locked dead onto Jensen's throat. I took one step forward, a cold smile creeping onto my face. 3 seconds. I just need 3 seconds to show you two exactly what dying feels like. They thought $500 bought them a breathing punching bag. A complete humiliation for a desperate woman. But these spoiled brats didn't realize that 30 minutes ago, their cheap arrogance unlocked the cage to a monster. Gray water squeezed through the cracked plastic ringer, spilling into the bucket with a sickening splash. I shifted my weight. My right knee popped, a sharp, muffled grind of bone on bone that echoed in the empty corridor. 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night at Hart Elite Athletic. The air in the North Wing was thick with the suffocating stench of cheap industrial ammonia burning the back of my throat. Across the massive expanse of imported tatami mats, Jensen and Jaden bounced on their toes. They wore custom-tailored sparring uniforms, pristine white fabric, snapping sharply with every movement. Even from 50 feet away, I could smell the heavy waft of Tom Ford cologne masking their sweat. They laughed. Loud and titled, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. I stared down at my hands. These fingers used to tear apart and reassemble a standard-issue rifle in 15 seconds flat in pitch darkness. Now the skin was peeling raw and blistered red from working without rubber gloves. I gripped the wooden handle of the mop, dragging the filthy strings across the hardwood floor my biological father had paid for with his own sweat. I moved with extreme mechanical precision. Straight lines, no overlapping, a perfect invisible grid. Heavy leather-soled shoes clicked against the floorboards right behind me. Richard Vance. The building manager stopped just short of the wet floor line. I could smell the stale coffee breath radiating off him. He pointed a stubby fat finger at a streak of gray water near the baseboards. "Hart. The North Wing needs to be bone dry by 10. Vance barked, his voice carrying that grating tone of middle management authority. "One complaint from the boys tonight and you're out on the street. I don't care what your last name is." He jerked his chin up, straightened his cheap polyester tie, and turned on his heel. I didn't say a word. I didn't even blink. I just gave a slow mechanical nod. Years of conditioned discipline taught me one thing. You never waste your breath on a dog barking from behind its owner's legs. I dipped the mop back into the murky water. Across the room, a loud thud echoed. Jensen slammed his shin into the heavy bag, cursing loudly. His high-priced personal trainer bailed on him again. He paced the edge of the mat, face flushed red. He scanned the empty room, looking for something to break. His eyes locked onto my faded, oversized t-shirt. A cruel smirk spread across his face. He snapped his fingers. Jaden pushed himself off the mirrored wall, chuckling softly. He reached into the pocket of his designer track pants and pulled out a thick reptile skin wallet. A heavy gold money clip caught the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. They walked toward me, their expensive shoes squeaking against the polished floor. I stopped mopping. I stood up straight, my spine rigid, dropping my shoulders into a neutral, balanced stance. Trainer didn't show, Jensen said, stopping at the edge of the puddle. He looked me up and down like a piece of broken equipment. We need a moving target to warm up. You're built like a brick wall anyway. Jaden stepped up beside him. He peeled 3 crisp $100 bills from the gold clip. With a lazy flick of his wrist, he tossed them. The paper fluttered down, landing right in the puddle of filthy bleach water at my boots. $300, Jaden said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. Put the headgear on, get on the mat, and stand completely still. The silence in the room became deafening. The only sound was the slow drip of gray water falling from the mop strings. My hands tightened around the wooden handle. I squeezed until the wood groaned and my knuckles turned completely white. My jaw locked tight enough to crack a tooth. $300, soaking wet in chemical filth. My eyes drifted down to the bills floating in the grime, my stomach twisting into a hard, painful knot. $300 was exactly what I needed to keep a roof over my daughter's head. The sight of those $100 bills floating in the bleach water made the back of my throat burn. It pulled me straight back to a memory I'd spent 3 years trying to bury. 3 years ago, I stood on the massive slate porch of the Hart estate. I had just come back from a 12-month tour overseas. My canvas duffel bag dug into a shoulder that hadn't healed properly, and my left boot was soaked through with blood seeping from a poorly stitched wound. I just wanted my old room, a shower, a bed that didn't smell like cordite and dried mud. Instead, the heavy oak door cracked open, and Evelyn stood in the gap. My stepmother wore a silk robe, sipping coffee from a bone china mug. She didn't look at my bleeding leg. She didn't look at my hollow eyes. She looked right past me, holding up a thick stack of notarized papers with my father's signature stamped across the bottom line. Your father wanted the boys and me taken care of. She said, her voice smooth and flat, completely devoid of warmth. You chose a rough life, Megan. You can handle yourself. The estate is ours now. Don't come back here. Then the heavy oak door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place, a heavy final thud. While I was bleeding out on the other side of the world, getting patched up in a crowded VA hospital, Evelyn had been busy. She manipulated my dying father. She had the title to the house, the bank accounts, and total ownership of Hart Elite transferred into her name. Jensen and Jaden slid effortlessly into executive chairs while I was learning how to walk without a cane. Not one phone call. Not one dime to help me get back on my feet. They slapped a cheap coat of legal paint over a robbery and called it inheritance. I didn't hire a lawyer. You don't fight a well-funded thief in a courtroom when you don't even have enough money to buy a hot meal. A harsh vibration against my thigh snapped me out of it. I pulled my phone out of my cargo pants. The cracked screen glowed a sickly yellow under the gym lights. A text from Marcus Thorne, the slumlord who owned the crumbling apartment complex where I lived. $800 for rent by Friday. Or you and the kid pack your trash and get out. I rubbed my thumb over the shattered glass. I had $42 to my name. The brutal Seattle winter was closing in fast. The draft in our apartment was so bad you could see your breath in the kitchen. My 7-year-old daughter Chloe had been coughing for a week straight, wrapped in a faded thrift store blanket on a mattress shoved into the corner of the floor. $42. Rent was $800. A decent bottle of cough syrup was $15. Pride doesn't buy medicine, self-respect doesn't keep the heat on. I slowly raised my head. I looked straight through the smug, entitled grin plastered on Jaden's face. I didn't scream. I didn't argue about the money rotting in the mop bucket. I locked my eyes onto his, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and completely dead. $500. Jaden stopped laughing. The room went still. Cash. Up front? I added, stepping away from the mop handle. For a second, the spoiled rich kid actually looked thrown off balance by the absolute lack of emotion in my face. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He flicked 2 more bills from the gold clip, letting them drop to the wet floor. I didn't hesitate. I crouched down, ignoring the sharp, grinding noise in my knee, and picked up the soaking wet bills. I folded the damp money, shoving it deep into my pocket. I kicked the yellow bucket against the baseboard and walked straight toward the locker room. The locker room air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. It reeked of eucalyptus steam pumping out from the adjacent luxury sauna, a smell designed for rich people trying to sweat out their expensive hangovers. I peeled my faded gray t-shirt over my head and tossed it onto the wooden locker bench. It landed with a dull, damp slap heavy with the stench of industrial floor wax. I stood barefoot in front of the massive gold-leaf mirror covering the back wall. My father had that mirror shipped over from Italy 20 years ago when he opened this place. Now it belonged to Evelyn. And it reflected someone who didn't belong in this high-end facility. It reflected the evening janitor. But the body in the glass told a completely different story. A deep puckered scar the size of a lemon sat ugly and jagged on my left hip. The skin around it was permanently discolored, twisted tight over the bone. My right shoulder dropped nearly a full inch lower than my left. The permanent physical receipt for years spent hauling 100-pound packs across burning sand on the other side of the world. My knuckles were thick, calloused, and currently raw from wringing out dirty mop water. This wasn't a body built for scrubbing baseboards. It was a machine built for surviving hell. I walked over to the lost and found bin in the corner. I dragged out a loaner sparring jacket and pants. The heavy canvas was stiff rough and stained a faint, ugly yellow around the collar from someone else's dried sweat. I shoved my arms through the heavy sleeves. The coarse fabric scraped across my skin like fine grit sandpaper, irritating the scar on my hip. I grabbed a frayed white belt off the hook. My fingers moved on absolute autopilot. Muscle memory took over in a fraction of a second. I snapped the belt around my waist and pulled it hard, locking it into a flawless, perfectly symmetrical square knot. The thick canvas bound my chest tight. It restricted my breathing, pressing down on my ribs. It was a suffocating physical reminder of exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. Strapped into a cheap, discarded uniform. Owned and operated by a stepmother and two half-brothers who stole an entire legacy with nothing but a fountain pen and a fake smile. I leaned forward over the chrome sink. The cold metal bit into my stomach. I stared directly into my own dark, dead eyes in the glass. I had been chained to the wall of a pitch-black dirt cellar halfway across the globe. I spent 48 straight hours getting beaten to a pulp by men who wanted nothing more than to watch me die. I took every hit. I swallowed every drop of blood. And I never gave them a single sound. Jensen and Jaden. A couple of spoiled brats in designer tracksuits looking for a human punching bag. They were nothing. They were a joke. They thought $300 bought them total dominance. They thought they were purchasing my dignity to wipe their custom shoes on. But they were only renting my flesh for 30 minutes. My will didn't belong to them. It never would. A single drop of water fell from the chrome faucet. It hit the porcelain basin. Plink. I closed my eyes, letting the sharp sound ground me in reality. My bare toes gripped the damp tile. The cold shot straight up my legs. I needed that cough medicine. I needed to hand Marcus Thorne $800 so he wouldn't throw our garbage bags onto the curb in the freezing rain. That was the only thing that mattered tonight. Endure it. I whispered to the empty room, my voice a harsh rasp. Get the cash. For Chloe. I turned away from the gold mirror. I pushed the heavy locker room door open, stepping out barefoot onto the freezing hardwood floor. Down the hall, standing on the edge of the mat, the two little wolves were waiting. Jaden kicked the red foam headgear across the mat. It skittered over the tatami, stopping near my bare feet with a hollow plastic rattling sound. I picked it up. The cheap foam smelled like stale sweat and Lysol. I pulled it over my head, fastening the Velcro strap tightly under my jaw. It felt like a muzzle. Next came the heavy sparring gloves. Forcing my hands into the thick padded synthetic leather felt incredibly wrong. The thick padding bound my fingers together, rendering my hands completely useless. In a real fight for survival on a dark street, wrapping your hands in foam meant you couldn't grip a blade. You couldn't grab a throat. You were defenseless. The feeling of being restrained sent an involuntary wave of tension shooting straight up the muscles in my back. Across from me, Jensen rolled his shoulders, a cocky smirk plastered on his face. Stand perfectly still and take it, big sister, Jensen mocked, bouncing lightly on the balls of his expensive shoes. I didn't answer. I dropped my center of gravity, shifting my weight into my heels. I raised the padded gloves covering my face and waited. Jensen lunged. A sloppy, overextended left jab. My eyes didn't look at his glove. They immediately tracked his left shoulder. It twitched upward a full half-second before the punch even started. He telegraphed the move completely. As his arm shot out, a massive gap opened wide under his armpit. If we were standing in some dirt alley halfway across the globe, I would have slipped inside that gap, gripped his elbow, and snapped his arm backward before he even realized he missed. But I clamped my jaw shut. I locked down every instinct wired into my nervous system. I forced my body to freeze. Thud. The padded glove cracked against my forehead. The impact was weak, lacking any real power, but the humiliation stung far worse. Too slow, trash. Jensen laughed. He followed up with a clumsy combination of side kicks and hooks. His footwork was a disaster. He crossed his feet twice, leaving himself completely off balance. He wasn't striking to do damage, he was performing. He was throwing flashy point-scoring moves just to hear Jaden cheering and clapping from the sidelines. I stood like a stone wall. I let the padded gloves smack against my forearms and the foam headgear. Smack, thud, crack. I was nothing but cold, dead meat. A breathing heavy bag getting paid to absorb a spoiled rich kid's temper tantrum. I kept my eyes empty, staring straight ahead through the narrow slit of the headgear. Then from the sidelines, Jaden's shrill laughter cut through the gym. "Look at her, take it," Jaden hollered, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Mom was right. Your mother was nothing but a cheap whore looking for a meal ticket. Good thing she died before she could see her daughter scrubbing our floors for loose change." The air in my lungs turned to ice. My mother. The woman who worked double shifts at a diner just to buy my first pair of shoes. "Maybe if you beg," Jaden continued, laughing harder. "Evelyn will let you bring that sickly little brat of yours here to clean the toilets." The mention of Chloe, the mention of my dead mother. The heavy mechanical wall inside my mind cracked. The dutiful silent janitor shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Jensen saw my eyes shift. He saw me lose focus for a fraction of a second. Eager to show off for his brother, he planted his left foot, twisting his hips with all the cowardly force he could muster. He aimed high. A brutal sweeping roundhouse kick tore through the air, whistling sharply as it hurtled straight toward the vulnerable, scarred flesh on the left side of my ribs. The air inside the massive training room turned to solid concrete. After those two words left my mouth, nobody moved. The echo of Jaden's shrill laughter died instantly, swallowed by the low hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. The heavy stench of their expensive cologne suddenly smelled stale against the sharp tang of copper pooling in my mouth. A heavy, warm drop of blood slipped from my busted lower lip. It slid down my chin and dripped onto the collar of the cheap canvas jacket. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't even blink. My right knee popped again, a harsh, grinding sound in the quiet room, but this time I locked the joint. I drove my weight straight down through my heels, gripping the tatami mat with my bare toes. The posture of the broken, exhausted janitor melted away. My shoulders pulled back. My spine straightened into a perfectly rigid line. The quiet, submissive woman carrying a mop bucket was gone. What woke up inside me was the cold mechanical survivor forged in dirt cellars half a world away. A place where one wrong breath meant you came home in a pine box. I reached up to my jaw. The Velcro strap tore open with a sharp, violent ripping sound that cut through the dead silence. I pulled the cheap red foam headgear off and threw it like a fast pitch. It flew across the room, smashing violently against the tempered glass display case holding Jensen's shiny purchased championship trophies. The plastic cracked against the glass with a loud smack, a warning shot. Next came the sparring gloves. I bit the thumb of the left glove, pulling it off, then ripped the right one away, tossing them onto the floor. My bare hands were finally free. The gym lights caught the thick, heavy calluses covering my knuckles, scars tracing across the back of my hands from things these spoiled boys only saw in late-night movies. These hands weren't built for pushing a mop or scrubbing baseboards with cheap ammonia. They were built for mechanical destruction. They were programmed to dismantle human joints exactly the same way a mechanic rips a rusted hinge off a broken door. Jensen stood exactly 3 feet away from me. He blinked hard. The arrogant, entitled smirk plastered on his face stiffened, melting down into something much closer to primal confusion. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His breathing turned shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven jerks. The thick fog of trust fund arrogance clouding his brain was finally colliding with raw physical dread. He was looking at a predator, and his nervous system knew it before his conscious brain did. I tilted my head perfectly still. I didn't look at his fists. I didn't look at his eyes. I locked my vision strictly on his shoulders and his hips. The foundation. The structural load-bearing walls of the human body. You don't waste time trying to block a moving fist. You break the foundation and the whole house collapses. If you've ever had a toxic family member try to use their money or their status to walk all over you, hit that like button right now. Leave a comment below with a single word. Just type, enough, if you know exactly how it feels when the limit has finally been crossed. Make sure you subscribe because you're not going to want to miss what happens when the gloves actually come off. My dead, unblinking silence completely broke Jensen. His fragile ego, built entirely on his mother's stolen money and overpriced personal trainers, couldn't handle the absolute disrespect. I was standing there completely unarmed, staring right through him like he was already a corpse on the floor. "Who do you think you're threatening, you crazy bitch?" Jensen roared. His voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the panic bubbling in his chest. He completely abandoned any technique. He just wanted to hurt me to put the servant back in her place. He shifted his weight backward, his calf muscle flexing hard against the mat. He lunged at me like a blind torpedo, throwing his entire body weight into a wild sweeping right hook aimed straight for the side of my head. The countdown clock in my head started ticking. 3 seconds. 1. Jensen's right hook tore through the air, whistling with all the sloppy, desperate force he could manage. Kids who train for points always believe in keeping distance. They want room to show off their form. I didn't. Instead of stepping back to dodge the blow, I dropped my center of gravity and slid half a step straight forward, burying myself inside his personal space. The punch flew harmlessly past my left ear, fanning my cheek. By moving in, I completely crushed his room to breathe. Jensen froze, his eyes widening in pure shock. He stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward into nothing but empty air. 2. My left hand shot up like an iron clamp. I grabbed the thick, heavy canvas collar of his custom uniform, right at the back of his neck. There was no polite grabbing here. I twisted my wrist hard, rolling the fabric tight and choking the collar directly across his windpipe. At the exact same second, I brought my right forearm up like a sledgehammer. I slammed the bone of my arm straight up under his chin. The impact drove his head violently backward. The cartilage in his neck snapped with a sickening, audible crack that echoed through the gym. 3. With his head bent backward, Jensen's entire 200 pounds of weight shifted uselessly onto his heels. His balance was gone. He was nothing but a falling tree waiting to be chopped down. I didn't use a sweeping kick designed to score points on a scoreboard. I destroyed the foundation. I drove the edge of my bare, scarred foot brutally into the soft spot right behind his knee. The joint buckled instantly. The heavy canvas of his pants snapped tight. Boom! Jensen's entire body flipped backward. 200 pounds of flesh and bone slammed into the tatami mat with enough force to shake the floorboards beneath us. The air exploded out of his lungs in a violent, wet gasp. I didn't step back. I didn't wait for an imaginary referee to blow a whistle. Before his shoulders even settled on the mat, I dropped my entire body weight downward. I drove my right knee straight into his ribcage, pinning him flat against the floor. The air completely left the room. Jensen's eyes bulged, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, desperately trying to pull oxygen into his crushed chest. I leaned over him. My right hand was clenched into a tight, rock-hard fist, hovering exactly 2 inches above the bridge of his nose. I could see the absolute terror swimming in his eyes. The money, the status, the expensive clothes, none of it was in the room with us right now. It was just him, me, and the brutal reality of physics. The moves I used to keep my brothers breathing so they could go home to their families, I was now using to discipline my own blood. "That's 3 seconds," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I leaned slightly closer, pressing my knee just a fraction deeper into his ribs. He choked, a quiet whimpering sound vibrating in the back of his throat. "You see, Jensen," I said, cold and detached. "When both of your feet leave the ground, you're dead." Behind me, the squeak of expensive rubber soles scrambled against the hardwood floor. Heavy, frantic footsteps charged toward my blind spot. Jaden, screaming. You bitch! Jaden shrieked, his voice cracked high-pitched and hysterical. Heavy, frantic footsteps rushed me from just outside my peripheral vision. He didn't know the first thing about fighting. He threw a wild, desperate haymaker aimed directly at the back of my neck. I didn't even turn my head. Muscle memory took over. I let go of Jensen's ribs and dropped low. I used my ruined, misshapen right shoulder, the one that hung an inch too low from carrying impossible weight, for years to roll my body tightly across Jensen's chest. Jaden's sloppy punch caught nothing but empty air. His momentum carried him forward, sending him stumbling awkwardly over his brother's legs. He lost his footing. I didn't. I came out of the roll in a deep crouch. Like a coiled spring finally releasing tension, I launched myself upward. My left hand shot out and clamped down hard around Jaden's wrist before he could catch his balance. I didn't punch him. I just twisted. I cranked his wrist backward at a vicious 45-degree angle. A loud, dry popping sound echoed off the high ceilings as the cartilage in his wrist separated. Jaden screamed. It wasn't a yell of anger. It was the shrill, terrified squeal of a spoiled rich kid feeling real, physical consequences for the very first time. Tears instantly flooded his eyes. The heavy stench of sour, panic-induced sweat radiated off his skin, completely overpowering the expensive Tom Ford cologne he had sprayed on an hour ago. Using his own flailing momentum against him, I swept my right leg hard against the inside of his knee. He collapsed face first into the tatami mat with a heavy thud. I dropped down, driving my shin brutally into his lower back to pin his spine to the floor. Before he could even draw a breath to scream again, I slid my right forearm under his chin. I clamped my hand onto my own left bicep, locking my arms into a suffocating meat vise directly across his windpipe. Evelyn taught you boys that you were kings in this building, didn't she? I whispered directly into his ear. My voice was completely flat, ice cold. You want to smell what real death is like, Jaden? He couldn't answer. He couldn't breathe. His free hand slapped the mat in a panicked, frantic rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. He was begging. He thought this was a game with a referee waiting to save him. Over in the corner of the room, Jensen was crawling backward until his shoulders hit the mirrored wall. He clutched his bruised ribs, his face drained of all color, watching his brother get dismantled in less than 5 seconds. The illusion of their upper-class superiority was entirely shattered on the floor. I felt Jaden's jaw trembling violently against my forearm. I held the pressure for exactly 3 more seconds, just long enough for the pupils in his eyes to dilate, just long enough for the pure, unadulterated terror of suffocation to imprint itself permanently onto his brain. Then, I let go. I shoved him away in disgust. He rolled onto his side, coughing and gasping, choking on his own spit as he curled into the fetal position. I stood up slowly. I didn't look at either of them. The silence in the gym was absolute, broken only by the pathetic sound of the 2 heirs to the Hart estate wheezing on the floor. I reached down and calmly dusted off the knees of my cheap canvas pants. I turned my back on them. I walked slowly across the mat, scanning the floorboards, looking for the crumpled $100 bills Jaden had thrown into the bleach puddle. The massive training room was completely silent now, save for the pathetic rattling wheeze of 2 grown men struggling to pull oxygen back into their lungs. The adrenaline rush that had carried me through the last 60 seconds began to drain away, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its place. The deep cartilage in my right knee throbbed. The torn muscles in my lowered shoulder burned. But I didn't let my posture slip. Not even an inch. I scanned the polished hardwood floor beneath the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. 5 crumpled $100 bills were scattered near the yellow mop bucket. I walked over, moving with a stiff, deliberate slowness. I crouched down the joint in my knee, grinding loudly, and picked up the bills one by one. The last $100 bill was soaking wet, stained gray from the chemical bleach puddle. I held it in my calloused hand, using my thumb to smooth out the creases. I folded the wet money neatly in half, pressing the edges flat, and shoved it deep into the heavy pocket of my cargo pants. There was no humiliation in this movement. I wasn't collecting charity. I was collecting my bloody, hard-earned paycheck. What the hell kind of trick was that? Jaden stammered. He was slumped against the mirrored wall, his face pale and slick with sour sweat. He cradled his rapidly swelling wrist against his chest. his voice trembling uncontrollably. Mom said you were useless. You didn't even look at my hands when I swung. I stood up straight, brushing a speck of invisible dust off the coarse canvas of my pants. I looked down at him with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. Evelyn taught you boys how to watch the hands so you could score points in front of judges. I said, my voice dead flat. In places where there are no rules, I don't look at the punch. I destroy the foundation that keeps the punch standing. Across the mat, Jensen was finally pushing himself up onto his elbows. The pure terror in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a sick, desperate kind of greed. His checkbook mentality was kicking right back in. He still believed every problem in the world had a price tag. Quit this garbage janitor job, Megan. Jensen wheezed, rubbing his bruised ribs. Come work for us. Be our personal security. The regional tournament is next week. We'll pay you triple what you make cleaning toilets. He actually thought this was a job interview. He thought the $500 sitting in my pocket was a down payment on my loyalty. I turned my head, locking my eyes onto his. I gave him the single most disgusted look I'd ever given another human being. Keep your stolen gym, Jensen, I said, my voice dripping with absolute venom. This money isn't for security. This is cough medicine for your niece. I pointed a scarred, calloused finger directly at his face. You can buy fancy uniforms. You can buy private trainers. But you will never have enough money in that wallet to buy my desperation. Because unlike you, I don't have a rich mommy standing behind me writing checks to fix my failures. If you've ever had to swallow your pride and do something humiliating just to keep your kids fed and safe, hit that like button to show you understand. Leave a comment below with the word sacrifice if you know exactly how heavy that burden is. And make sure you subscribe because this family drama is about to get a lot darker. I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't care if he did. I turned my back on both of them, grabbed the heavy yellow mop bucket by the handle, and walked toward the exit. I pushed my weight against the heavy metal crash bar of the front doors. The glass swung open, letting the freezing, biting wind of the Seattle rain wash over my face. The warm, artificial air of the Hart estate vanished behind me, replaced by the brutal reality of the long, cold walk home. The number 42 night bus rattled violently as its heavy tires slammed into a deep pothole on Rainier Avenue. Freezing Seattle rain lashed diagonally against the grime-streaked window, blurring the neon signs of cheap liquor stores sliding past. I sat alone on the very last bench. My thin jacket was completely soaked through. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow. My body started cashing the check for the violence I just committed. The deep cartilage in my right knee throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. My ruined right shoulder ached right down to the bone. I kept my right hand buried deep inside my damp pocket, my calloused fingers clutching the 5 crumpled $100 bills. There were no medals for what I did tonight. No applause. Just the heavy stench of wet wool and diesel exhaust filling the empty bus. 40 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy rusted metal door of my apartment building. It was located deep inside a decaying housing project, the kind of place the city stopped pretending to care about 10 years ago. The narrow hallway immediately choked me with the permanent greasy smell of boiled cabbage and burnt cooking oil. I dragged my swollen knee up 3 flights of concrete stairs. I slid my key into the sticky deadbolt and pushed the door open. The apartment was pitch black and freezing. The radiator under the window had been broken since early November. I toed off my muddy work boots by the door, wincing as the cheap peeling floorboards creaked under my bare feet. I walked quietly toward the bedroom. The door was cracked open just an inch. I leaned my heavy shoulder against the doorframe, looking inside. Chloe was curled up into a tiny ball in the far corner of the room. She was sleeping on a thin mattress placed directly on the floor, buried under a faded, mismatched quilt I bought from a thrift store for $6. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Every few seconds, her little chest hitched, followed by a dry, rattling cough that tore at the back of her throat. The cold iron shell I wore at the gym, the ruthless monster I used to choke the air out of the men who shared my blood, just crumbled. It fell away in heavy, useless pieces. Standing in the dark, watching my 7-year-old shiver in a freezing room, I wasn't a survivor. I wasn't a predator. I was just an exhausted, terrified mother, completely powerless to keep the cold away from my only child. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat thick and agonizing. I turned away from her door, walking back into the cramped kitchen. The countertops were made of cheap particle board, peeling at the edges. I walked over to the table. Sitting right in the center, pinned under a greasy glass salt shaker, was the eviction notice from Marcus Thorne. Pay or quit, 72 hours. I pulled my hand out of my wet pocket. I laid the $500 bills down on the peeling wood, pressing them flat next to the notice. $500. A temporary painkiller for the cancer of being poor. It bought me exactly nothing. I was still $300 short, and Friday morning was coming fast. I pulled out a cheap wooden chair and sat down heavily. I rested my elbows on the table and buried my face in my scarred, calloused hands. The utter exhaustion of fighting a war on two fronts, one against my own family, one against poverty, was finally suffocating me. Suddenly, a harsh buzzing vibration rattled against the wood. I lifted my head. My cheap cracked phone, sitting next to the pile of wet money, was vibrating violently. The sickly pale blue light from the shattered screen illuminated the dark kitchen ceiling. A text message from an unknown number. I narrowed my eyes against the harsh, sickly blue light radiating from the cracked phone screen. My thumb hovered over the shattered glass. It was an unknown number. "It's Jensen. We forced Vance to give us your cell." My jaw tightened. I moved my thumb toward the power button, fully intending to shut the phone off and throw it across the dark kitchen. I didn't have the patience for another empty threat from a bruised ego. Before I could press down, a second message pushed through. "You were right. We're idiots. Mom lied to us this whole time. She said you were damaged goods, that you were useless. We don't know a damn thing about keeping ourselves alive." I stopped. I stood perfectly still in the freezing kitchen, my bare feet rooted to the peeling floorboards. These overgrown, spoiled kids didn't run crying to their mother. The physical brutality they experienced 2 hours ago didn't just bruise their ribs, it completely shattered the protective, arrogant shell they had worn their entire lives. They realized they were nothing but show dogs living in a gilded cage. A third message popped onto the screen. "We canceled the tournament. We're done being her little point-scoring puppets. Teach us how to actually survive, Megan. Name your price. We'll pay anything." I looked away from the phone, staring out the tiny kitchen window. Heavy freezing raindrops slid down the dirty glass. The thick, suffocating darkness outside was just starting to crack, bleeding into a pale gray dawn over the Seattle skyline. A cold, calculating plan began to lock into place inside my head. This wasn't a request for a private lesson. This was an opportunity. Evelyn had spent 3 years building an empire out of my father's stolen legacy, using these two boys as the polished, smiling faces of her business. They were her prized assets. But right now, her assets were terrified, and absolute fear breeds absolute respect. If I could break Jensen and Jaden down, if I could strip away their entitlement and rebuild them into tools that obeyed my voice instead of hers, I wouldn't just be a janitor anymore. I would have a crowbar lodged directly into the foundation of Evelyn's empire. I could rip the entire thing apart from the inside out. I could take back the estate. I could buy Chloe a bed that didn't sit on a freezing floor. I looked down at the 5 crumpled $100 bills sitting on the table next to my eviction notice. They thought money was the answer to everything. I was about to show them exactly how worthless their bank accounts really were. My calloused thumb hovered over the cracked glass keypad. I typed out my response with absolute mechanical precision. No emotion, no bargaining, just pure, unadulterated authority. Pier 42, 5 a.m. tomorrow. I hit the spacebar. Bring running shoes. Leave the credit cards and the attitudes at home. I paused for a fraction of a second, the deep ache in my shoulder, reminding me of the price I had paid to learn the lessons I was about to teach them. I added one final sentence. If you puke, you walk. My thumb pressed down hard on the send button. The tiny paper airplane icon swooshed across the screen. I set the phone face down on the cheap particle board table. The sickly blue light vanished, plunging the kitchen back into the shadows. My body was completely broken. My joints were burning and my lungs were heavy with exhaustion. But as the first sliver of morning light crept across the peeling floorboards, I finally smiled. The game was far from over. I officially held the keys to the estate.